There's a painting in the New Hampshire State Museum that almost no one notices. It hangs in a back corridor. Away from the main exhibits, the painting shows a family gathering from 1902. 17 people arranged around a long dining table. And if you look carefully at the faces, you'll see something impossible. The couples seated together don't just look similar. They're mirror images of each other. Perfect reflections. Because in the Harlow family of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, every firstborn son didn't just marry within the family. He married his identical twin sister. For 6 generations, from 1847 to 1963, this wasn't a secret kept from the family. It was a sacred duty, a covenant written in blood and passed down like an heirloom. The children were raised knowing exactly who they would marry. There was no choice, no escape, no other future, until 1963, when a 17-year-old girl did something that would end the bloodline forever. But what she had to do to break free would haunt her for the rest of her life. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. In 1844, a man named Elias Harlow stood trial in Boston for heresy. He had been a respected minister in the Congregationalist Church until he began preaching what his congregation called dangerous ideas. Elias believed that human beings had strayed from God's original design, that marriage between strangers diluted divine bloodlines, that the closest spiritual union possible was between those who shared the same soul, split at birth. Twins, he preached, were God's perfect creation, 2 halves of one whole. And reuniting them in marriage was not sin, it was restoration. The church expelled him, his wife left him, his own children refused to speak to him. But Elias didn't recant, he doubled down. He began writing a theological text he called The Covenant of Mirrors. In it, he laid out a detailed argument combining scripture, philosophy, and what he believed was divine revelation. He claimed that in the Garden of Eden, before the fall, Adam and Eve were not separate beings, but twins born of the same clay, the same breath. Their separation was humanity's first corruption. And only through twin union could that original purity be restored. By 1847, Elias had attracted a small following. 12 families, all outcasts from traditional churches, all drawn to his radical ideas. Together they pooled their resources and purchased land in rural New Hampshire, near the Maine border. They called their settlement Harmony. They built simple wooden homes, a meeting house, farmland, and they began living according to Elias's covenant. But there was a problem. Most of the families didn't have twins. Elias's own children were grown and scattered. So the covenant, as he envisioned it, would take time to implement. It would require planning, patience, and absolute faith. Elias made a decree. From that point forward, any family in the community that produced twins would raise them according to specific rules. The twins would be kept together always. They would share a room, wear matching clothing, study the same lessons. They would be taught from infancy that they were 2 parts of one soul. And when they reached maturity at age 18, they would marry in the community's meeting house. The first set of twins born in Harmony arrived in 1851, a boy and a girl, born to Elias's daughter Rebecca and her husband Thomas. Elias was there for the birth. He wept when he saw them. He called them proof of God's favor. The children were named Samuel and Sarah. Mirror names, Elias insisted, S and S. The boy was dressed in blue, the girl in white, but otherwise their lives were identical in every way. Samuel and Sarah Harlow grew up believing they were blessed. Everyone in Harmony told them so. Elias, now called prophet by the community, personally oversaw their education. They learned to read from the same primer, sitting side by side. They memorized passages from the Covenant of Mirrors together. They were never separated, not even for sleep. Their bedroom contained two narrow beds pushed together, and every night before they slept they were required to hold hands and recite, "We are one soul, twice born, forever joined." As they grew older, the community's expectations became explicit. Sarah was taught to sew her own wedding dress starting at age 12. Samuel was instructed in the rituals of the marriage ceremony, what words he would speak, what vows he would take. There was no discussion of what would happen if they refused. Refusal wasn't a possibility anyone acknowledged. On their 18th birthday in April 1869, Samuel and Sarah were married in the Harmony Meeting House. Elias performed the ceremony. He was 71 years old by then, gaunt and trembling, but his voice was strong. He spoke of divine restoration, of purity reclaimed, of two halves made whole. Samuel and Sarah stood before the congregation holding hands. Witnesses later described them as calm, almost serene. They spoke their vows clearly, they kissed briefly. They were proclaimed husband and wife. That night they consummated the marriage in a small cabin that had been prepared for them. The next morning, Sarah emerged and rang the community bell, as tradition required. The sound signaled that the covenant had been fulfilled. The community gathered and sang hymns of celebration. Elias died 6 months later in November 1869. His final words, recorded by those present, were, "The first branch has grown, let the tree flourish." Within a year, Sarah gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. They named them Elias and Eleanor. The cycle had begun over the next 50 years. The Harlow family expanded carefully, methodically. Not every generation produced twins, which the community interpreted as divine selection. When twins were born, they were raised according to the covenant. When they weren't, those children were married off to families outside Harmony, their bloodlines deemed too diluted to continue the sacred work. By 1900, 3 sets of Harlow twins had married each other. The family kept meticulous records, not in official government documents, but in private ledgers maintained by the family elders. These ledgers documented births, marriages, deaths, and something else, physical observations. The elders noticed patterns emerging. Certain features appeared more frequently in the covenant children. Blue-gray eyes, even in families where neither parent had them originally. Unusually symmetrical faces, a specific arch to the eyebrows. They interpreted these as signs of purity concentrating, bloodlines refining themselves. But other patterns emerged too, patterns they recorded but didn't discuss publicly. Children who died in infancy without clear cause. A boy born in 1889 who had 6 fingers on his left hand. A girl in 1897 who never grew taller than 4 feet. Her bones brittle and prone to fractures. The Harlow family didn't live in complete isolation. By the early 1900s, Harmony had evolved. Some families left, others joined. The community became a strange hybrid, part religious commune, part tight-knit New England village. They sold crops and crafts to neighboring towns. Some Harlow men worked in Portsmouth shipyards. The family had money, land, influence, but the covenant remained hidden. Outsiders saw a large, close-knit family. They didn't see what happened behind closed doors. They didn't see the twin children being raised in matched pairs, educated together, promised to each other before they understood what that meant. They didn't see the marriage ceremonies performed in private, with no legal documentation, no state recognition. The Harlow marriages existed in a gray space, not illegal because they were never officially registered. Not public because the family never spoke of them. And when children from these unions grew up and needed birth certificates or school records, creative paperwork was filed. Cousins were listed as parents. Uncles and aunts took legal guardianship. The true family tree was known only to those inside the covenant. World War II brought changes to Harmony. Young men were drafted. Some never came back. The community shrank. By 1945, only 2 extended Harlow family groups remained in the original settlement. The others had scattered to cities, assimilated into normal society, left the covenant behind. But the core family held firm. In 1947, another set of twins was born, James and Julia. Their father, Elias III, named after the founder, was a carpenter. Their mother, his twin sister Elizabeth, worked as a seamstress in Portsmouth. To the outside world, they were cousins raising children together after Elizabeth's supposed husband died in the war. A charitable arrangement. No one questioned it. James and Julia were raised in a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Harmony. The old meeting house had burned down in 1938, so the community now gathered in members' homes. The covenant was still taught, still practiced, but it had evolved. The theological justifications became less important than tradition itself. Elias's writings were still read, but more as heritage than active doctrine. The covenant continued because it had always continued. Because breaking it would mean admitting that 5 generations had been living a lie. James and Julia's childhood was structured around their eventual union. They attended the same school, sat in the same classes. At home, they shared a bedroom until age 14, when Julia's mother insisted they needed separate spaces. But even then, their rooms were adjacent, and the wall between them was thin. They could hear each other breathing at night. They grew up beautiful, both of them tall, with the distinctive Harlow features that had concentrated over generations. Dark hair, blue-gray eyes, high cheekbones. People in town noticed how similar they looked, like siblings, someone once said to their mother. Elizabeth just smiled and changed the subject. As they entered their teenage years, the family began preparing them more explicitly. Their parents explained the covenant when they were 15. James and Julia were told they would marry each other at 18. That this was their purpose, their destiny, their duty to the family and to God's design. James accepted it immediately. He had been conditioned to accept it. He loved his sister in the only way he had been taught to love. She was his constant companion, his mirror, his future. Julia's reaction was different. She said nothing for 3 days. Then she asked one question: "What if I don't want to?" Her mother's answer was simple: "That's not an option." Julia Harlow spent her 16th and 17th years in a state of quiet desperation. She couldn't talk to friends at school. The covenant was secret, and revealing it would destroy her family. She couldn't talk to family members. They were all invested in maintaining the tradition. She couldn't even fully articulate her feelings to herself. She loved her brother. That wasn't the problem. The problem was being told that love had to transform into something else, something she didn't want, something that felt wrong even though everyone around her insisted it was sacred. She tried to imagine running away, but where would she go? She was 17, with no money, no support system outside the family. And running away wouldn't save James. He would still be trapped in the expectation, still be told he had to marry, still be bound by a covenant he hadn't chosen. So Julia made a different choice. She started researching. The town library became her refuge. She read about genetics, about inbreeding, about the consequences of closed bloodlines. She read historical accounts of royal families who had married relatives for generations and suffered genetic collapse. She read about laws, about marriage requirements, about what made a marriage legally valid. And she discovered something crucial. The Harlow marriages, all of them going back to 1869, had never been legally registered. They were religious ceremonies performed by family elders with no legal authority, which meant technically they weren't marriages at all. The participants believed they were married. They lived as married couples, but in the eyes of the law, they were simply family members living together. This gave Julia an idea, a dangerous, desperate idea. If she could get proof of what the family had been doing, real documentation, she could go to authorities not just to escape her own fate, but to end the covenant entirely, to make it impossible for future generations of Harlow children to be trapped the way she and James were. She started slowly. Her parents kept papers in a locked desk drawer in their bedroom. Julia learned to pick the lock using a hairpin and a nail file. It took her weeks of practice on other locks in the house before she succeeded. Inside the drawer, she found what she needed. A family ledger, handwritten, dating back to 1869. It listed every twin birth, every covenant marriage, every child born from those unions. It included notes about physical abnormalities, deaths, instances where children had tried to refuse and been coerced. Her own name was already written in the ledger: Julia Harlow, born August 3, 1947. Covenant partner James Harlow. Marriage date August 3, 1965. Her 18th birthday was 2 months away. Julia photographed every page of the ledger using a camera she borrowed from school, claiming she needed it for a class project. She returned the ledger carefully, making sure everything was exactly as she found it. Then she waited. She needed one more thing: testimony, someone willing to speak on record about what the covenant actually entailed. She chose the only person she thought might help her: her grandmother, Eleanor Harlow, now 68 years old. Eleanor had been born into the covenant, married her twin brother in 1929, and raised 6 children. She had never expressed doubt publicly, but Julia had seen something in her eyes, a sadness, a resignation. So one afternoon, when they were alone, Julia asked her, "Grandmother, did you want to marry grandfather Elias, or were you made to?" Eleanor was silent for a long time. Then she said, "I was told it was God's will. I was told I had no choice. I believed it because everyone I trusted told me to believe it. But no, Julia, I didn't want it. I was afraid every day of my life until I was too old to be afraid anymore, and by then it was too late to be anything else." Julia asked if she would be willing to tell that to someone outside the family. Eleanor looked at her granddaughter and said, "If it would mean you don't have to live the way I did, I'll tell anyone you want." On June 15, 1963, 2 months before her 18th birthday, Julia Harlow walked into the Portsmouth Police Department with a folder containing 37 photographs and a handwritten statement from her grandmother. She asked to speak to someone about what she called an ongoing crime. The officer who took her statement was confused at first. Julia was calm, articulate, and the story she told sounded impossible. A multi-generational practice of arranged marriages between siblings hidden in plain sight for over a century. But she had documentation, photos of the ledger showing clear family trees where siblings were listed as spouses, names, dates, births. Eleanor's statement corroborating that these marriages were coerced, that children were raised with no choice, that the practice was ongoing. The officer called his supervisor. The supervisor called the state attorney general's office. By evening, investigators were interviewing Eleanor Harlow. She told them everything: how she had been raised to believe the covenant was divine, how she had been given no option to refuse, how her own children had been raised the same way, how her granddaughter was scheduled to be married to her grandson in 2 months. The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, social workers and law enforcement visited the Harlow properties. They interviewed family members. Most refused to speak. Some claimed religious freedom. The covenant, they argued, was a matter of faith. The government had no right to interfere. But the state's position was clear. While the marriages themselves weren't legally recognized, the coercion of minors into sexual relationships with family members was child abuse. The grooming that began in childhood was psychological abuse. And the evidence Julia provided showed a pattern spanning 6 generations. Criminal charges were filed against 3 living Harlow elders, including Julia's parents. The charges included child endangerment, coercion, and failure to report births and deaths properly. The case was complicated. Most of the victims were adults now. Many still believed the covenant was sacred and refused to cooperate with prosecutors. But Julia's testimony was devastating. She described her childhood, the constant messaging that she and James were one soul, the preparation for a marriage she didn't want. The moment her mother told her refusal wasn't an option, the jury heard all of it. In December 1963, Julia's parents and one uncle were convicted. They received suspended sentences and probation, contingent on psychological evaluation, and a court order that they never again arrange or encourage marriages between family members. The Harlow family fractured. Some members left New Hampshire entirely, moving to different states, changing their names. Others stayed but cut ties with the convicted elders. A few, the true believers, maintained that the covenant had been sacred and that Julia had betrayed something holy. James Harlow never spoke to his sister again. He was interviewed by investigators but refused to cooperate. He maintained that he and Julia were meant to be together, that she had been deceived by outside influences. He moved to Vermont in 1964 and lived alone. He never married anyone else. He died in 1998 at age 51 from a heart attack. In his will, he left everything to a religious organization dedicated to preserving traditional family structures. Julia tried to build a new life. She finished high school while living with a foster family. She attended college in Massachusetts, studying psychology. She wanted to understand what had been done to her and to others like her. She earned her degree, then a master's, then a doctorate. She became a therapist specializing in religious trauma and family coercion. She never married. She said in an interview years later that she couldn't imagine trusting someone enough to build a life with them. The people who were supposed to protect me sold me to a lie, she said. That doesn't go away just because you escape. Eleanor Harlow, the grandmother who had given testimony, died in 1966. She spent her final years estranged from most of her family, but she told friends she had no regrets. I saved my granddaughter, she said. That's more than I did for my own children. The Covenant of Mirrors, Elias Harlow's original theological text, was seized during the investigation. Copies were found in several Harlow homes. Legal scholars and theologians analyzed it. Most agreed it was a deeply flawed interpretation of Scripture mixed with 19th-century pseudoscience and personal delusion. But what made it dangerous wasn't its theology. It was its certainty. Elias Harlow had written with absolute conviction that he had discovered a divine truth, and that conviction, passed down through generations, had been enough to trap dozens of people in a system that robbed them of choice. The text was never published. The copies were archived in university libraries, accessible only to researchers. Harmony, the original settlement, was abandoned by the 1970s. The remaining buildings fell into disrepair. The land was eventually sold. Today it's a small residential subdivision. No historical marker acknowledges what happened there. In 2008, at age 61, Julia Harlow gave one final interview to a documentary filmmaker researching closed religious communities in America. The interview was never widely released. The filmmaker said Julia requested that it only be made public after her death. Julia died in 2018 from complications related to pneumonia. She was 71 years old. The interview was released in 2020. In it, Julia talks about the difficulty of explaining her childhood to people who didn't live it. People think coercion is always violent, she says. But mine was gentle. It was loving voices telling me I was special. It was being taught that my entire identity was tied to one person, one future. By the time I was old enough to question it, the questioning felt like betraying everyone I loved. She talks about the guilt, The knowledge that exposing the covenant destroyed her family, that her parents went to their graves believing she had damned herself, that her brother spent his entire adult life alone because of a future he had been promised and then denied. "I don't regret what I did," she says, "but I live with the weight of it every day. I freed myself, but I couldn't free everyone. Some of them didn't want to be freed." The interviewer asks her if she thinks the Harlow covenant could happen again. Julia pauses, then she says, "It's happening right now. Maybe not the exact same way. But any system that tells children they don't have a choice, that their bodies and futures belong to someone else's vision, that obedience is love, it's the same structure, it just wears different names." She talks about the children who were born from covenant marriages and grew up not knowing their true parentage. Some of them found out as adults, she says. "Imagine discovering that the family tree you thought you knew is actually a family column, that your parents were siblings, that you carry the genetic consequences of 6 generations of inbreeding. Some of them have had health issues, others haven't. But all of them live with the knowledge that they were the product of something that should never have happened." At the end of the interview, Julia is asked what she wants people to understand about her story she thinks for a long time. Then she says legacies aren't always treasures, sometimes they're prisons. And the bravest thing you can do is be the one who breaks the chain, even when everyone tells you the chain is sacred. Even when breaking it means you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you made the right choice. You did. You always did. The Harlow family records, including the ledger Julia photographed, are sealed in the New Hampshire State Archives. Access requires special permission and a research justification. As of 2024, fewer than a dozen researchers have reviewed them. The records confirm Julia's testimony. Between 1869 and 1963, 6 generations of Harlow twins were married to each other. 24 individuals total. 12 covenant marriages. From those unions, 41 children were born. 8 died in infancy. 7 more died before reaching adulthood. Of the 26 who survived to adulthood, 11 never married anyone. 7 married outside the family after the covenant ended. 5 remained in isolated parts of the country and their current status is unknown. 3 are confirmed deceased in the past decade. The youngest living descendant of the Harlow covenant marriages is believed to be in their early 60s. None have spoken publicly about their family history. The painting that hangs in the New Hampshire State Museum, the one showing the 1902 family gathering, includes 2 covenant couples. They sit across from each other at the dining table, mirror images, smiling. The museum label identifies them only as the Harlow family, circa 1902. It doesn't explain why the couples look identical. It doesn't mention the covenant most visitors never notice. But if you know the story, if you look closely at their eyes, you can see something the painter captured, perhaps unintentionally. The smiles are perfect, but the eyes aren't smiling at all. They're looking at something beyond the frame, something outside the painting. Maybe they were looking at freedom, at a world where children didn't grow up knowing exactly who they had to become, where love wasn't predetermined before you were old enough to understand what love meant, where breaking away didn't require destroying everything you'd ever known. Julia Harlow looked at that world, and she chose it, even though it cost her everything, even though she spent the rest of her life carrying the weight of that choice. She chose it because it was the only choice worth making. Some legacies are meant to end. Some covenants are meant to be broken. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is say no to something everyone else calls sacred, and call it by its real name, not destiny, not divine will, not love, just damage, wrapped in ritual, passed down until someone finally has the courage to let it die. If you made it to the end of this story, you've heard something most people don't know. something that was buried deliberately, something that continues in different forms, under different names, in communities that value tradition over the well-being of children. Julia Harlow's story matters not because it's shocking, but because it's a reminder that silence protects systems, not people. That family loyalty can become a weapon. That sacredness is sometimes just another word for control. Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if stories like this make you think differently about tradition, about family, about the price we pay for breaking free. And if you believe something like this couldn't happen now in the 21st century, ask yourself why you're so sure. Because certainty is always how these systems survive.